Today we are talking about more sustainable or aviation, air transport. Nowadays we do face dark times for the innovation sector, and we might wonder to what extent work is continuing behind the scenes on carbon tax, for example, or more technological solutions, for example, in the field of biofuels. We have invited 3 speakers for this purpose. The first speaker is Professor Jos Delbeke. I do not know whether I yet have to introduce Professor Delbeke, but nowadays he is a part-time professor at the School of Transnational Governance, and that's within the European University Institute in Florence. And beside that, he's also full professor at KU Leuven. Last week, he was appointed at the European University Institute for the first European Investment Bank Chair on Climate Change Policy and International Carbon Markets. And of course, you all may know that Professor Delbeke is the former Director General at the European Commission's DG Climate Action, and that was during the period between 2010 until 2018. Professor Delbeke, the digital floor is yours, and I will skip to the next slide and you can start.
Well, thank you very much, Wouter, and pleased to be part of this discussion today. I look forward to hear more about the study that TML was doing on biofuels and alternative fuels from Inge. And I'm also very pleased that Damien Maedows, a former colleague of mine, is at the panel today because he can shed some light about what is going to come at the European level in the coming months. So I presented, or I have the intention to present a few slides to you, not that many, but just to mark the state of affairs as of now. And on the next slide, you see that, in fact, in terms of governance, the picture is quite blurred. That is that the Paris Agreement, that is the marker for anything we are going to do in the coming decades, that the Paris Agreement is only indirectly mentioning the role of aviation by mentioning all emission sources and removals, but does not direct in an explicit manner international aviation or the maritime sector, which is a little bit of a downside. But, you know, the climate context is very clear, all sources and removals, that is a source of, or a basis on which we can work further. However, on the aviation side, we have the Chicago Convention, and there is no mentioning of climate change. By the time of the creation of the International Civil Aviation Organization, of course, climate change was not yet a problem, and I think what is on the agenda is to put that on the table of ICAO, and there is some progress there. I'm going to come back in a minute. Next slide, please. The scale of the challenge is daunting because ICAO expects that the emissions are going to grow, if only because the fuel burned is expected to grow with a factor of at least 300% between 2015 and 2045. So that is quite daunting because we know that the aviation sector today is already 2% of total emissions, and that's quite a bit. You know, that's comparable to the global steel sector, for example, or the global cement sector. But the real problem that we experienced in the EU when we were putting our policies on the table of ICAO are the very wide per capita differences. And with one blink of your eye on the picture that is put there, it is a business that is primarily between Europe and the United States and increasingly Asia. But very few lines you can find to Africa or Latin America or major parts of Asia. So that's a quite problematic starting point. That is that per capita, the emissions are very high in the EU and the United States and much lower elsewhere in the world. And that matters not only for CO2 emissions, but approximately 3 times is the impact of CO2 emissions on global warming coming from the aviation sector. That is that there are a complication not only about CO2, but also about the other emissions related to the flight. Next slide shows, and it is already an outdated slide since the study that was released this week by Ursula von der Leyen, but nevertheless I retained it because you can see in the last part of the columns by 2017, that's approximately where we are today. For example, for energy supply or energy use in manufacturing or industrial processes, we are on average already 30 to 40% below 1990. And if you look at the penultimate line, you see that on international aviation, for example, instead of 40% below 1990, we are 217% above 1990. So territorially speaking, we have been reducing the emissions in the economy, except on international aviation and on international maritime, but that's not the subject of our discussion today. On the next slide is highlighted what the Europeans have developed as their approach to reduce the climate impact of aviation, and they always went for a basket of measures. But in that basket of measures, where is support for R&D, improvements in air traffic management, renewable energy directive, is an important part because it comes to biofuels, and we will hear more of that from Inge today. But in that basket, the market-based measures, such as the EU ETS, has been a key element of the debate. And in that basket of measures, one thing stood up all the time, that is that we want an equal treatment of airlines on the routes. That is essential. We cannot enter into a scene, into a scenario where we would differentiate the treatment between airlines of European, of American origin compared to other airlines in the world. So equal treatment, which is the basis of ICAO, is a very important element. Now, we will hear more from Damien Maedows later, but the emphasis on pricing carbon is going to be reinforced in the future. There is the ETS that is going to be reinforced, and there is also the review of the Energy Tax Directive, for which there is an open consultation now ongoing. And I think that pricing carbon is going to become more important, and that is in stark contrast to the long history of exemptions from fuel taxes, VAT, you name it, in the field of aviation. So that tension is undoubtedly going to grow. Next slide shows a little bit what we try to do in the EU. In fact, in 2008, already there was a co-decision, which is quite a heavy decision-making process in the European Union. It was decided that international and European aviation would be included into the European ETS. And the date of delivery was the 1st of January 2012. And the real date of compliance was 2013. And just before, a couple of months before, we got a kind of row in the context of ICAO. And it was fueled by the US, but supported by many others, like the Russians, the Chinese, the Saudi Arabians, etc. So the EU was attacked for its so-called unilateral measure to include international aviation in the EU ETS. Now, a court case was initiated, and the European Court of Justice confirmed that the EU ETS is lawful and is not in breach of the so-called extraterritoriality principle. Nevertheless, the pressure was incredibly high, and it was decided to stop the clock on flights to and from the EU. And that is what we currently are having. In case our current legislation is not changed, we are going to see a reversal of the stop the clock decision by 2023. What we have, however, retained is that European flights remain covered by the EU ETS, and we have today that all airlines, even Chinese or Indian or American airlines making intra-European flights, that they are covered by the European emissions trading system. And we were able to enforce that. And I think that is a major achievement from where we can build further for the future. Next slide, please. In the meantime, as a reply, so to speak, to the EU ETS, the ICAO developed an offset mechanism called CORSIA, and that is a carbon offsetting mechanism to neutralize the additional growth in emissions from 2020. Now, it was a long story, and we have now that CORSIA mechanism, but still, has to start, and it starts only with a voluntary phase in 2020. And it is scheduled to become mandatory as of 2027. So one begs the question to whom the system is going to be voluntary. Is Europe going to find itself alone in this game, or whether the United States and others are going to join? If China, for example, following the announcement of yesterday, were to follow, that would be a major change to the success of CORSIA. But today, we have not heard anything of that, and it is a real question how many airlines are going to be part of that voluntary phase, let alone the quality of the offsets. You know, are these offsets going to represent real emission reductions? And, you know, as you mentioned, Wouter, at the beginning, we have the COVID-19. That is a major setback for the sector. Sector is fighting for survival. We don't know how much and how long that influence is going to take. That does not facilitate the taking of the ICAO, and the review of the baselines, for example, was an indication of that. Next slide, please. Now that we have ICAO, now that we have the EU ETS for European flights, it still begs the question what to do with fuel taxation, and many initiatives coming up in several member states, such as passenger charges. And in fact, the fuel taxation that we are currently having in Europe on the road fuels, on heating fuels, has a major exemption for aviation fuels. And we translated that aviation into our bilateral air service agreements. And in fact, it would be good if we could start reviewing those bilateral air service agreements to facilitate the imposition of an excise duty, even if it is a low one, on kerosene, for example, because the consumer is asking themselves, why is the use of gasoline for my vehicle being taxed, while in terms of aviation, the fuels are untouched because of this bilateral air service agreement. So it's more the bilateral air service agreements than the Chicago Convention that is the problem. Now, we began in the EU with that, but very slowly. It is in the mandate for future relationship with the UK. That is a very interesting development. We will see how much further that is going. Now, as a substitute, member states who had committed themselves not to use kerosene excise duties, they went for other kind of taxes, such as passenger duties or VAT on tickets and things like that. But these are all suboptimal kind of solutions, which are always going to be limited in impact. Now, interesting is, and I would like to underline that to all listeners, is that the public consultation for the review of the Energy Tax Directive is on its way until the 14th of October. And if people would think that in addition to ICAO, the CORSIA system, we need fuel taxation on kerosene, it's now the moment to let your voice heard. So next slide, please, comes for, and I would like to conclude with a little assessment. It's fair to say that we are not there yet when it comes to tackling aviation emissions. They keep rising. They keep rising in Europe. They keep rising globally. And that is in sharp contrast to the concept of climate neutrality that was put as an important goal in the Paris Agreement. And so that tension is going to grow and needs to be tackled. And needs to be tackled also not only by Europe, but also by the United States, by China, by major players where the aviation emissions are rapidly growing today. We will see how the outcome is of COVID-19. It's very hard to have any prediction on that, but the real question remains on the table: how to organize a better governance of aviation emissions globally and within Europe. Within Europe, we are going to see presumably a review of the EU ETS, where less free allowances will be given. But internationally, that is where the big challenge is there. Is CORSIA going to influence the emissions? Should we not look for additional instruments such as technology forcing? And I think that Inge is going to tell us more on that. For those, next slide, who would like to read more about aviation, but with a wider perspective about climate policy in Europe, you have the book that I was doing together with Peter Vis, Towards a Climate Neutral Europe, and it is free downloadable from the European Commission's DG CLIMA website. So for all those who are interested, you can have your free copy there. Thank you very much, Wouter, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Delbeke. Thank you very much for this overview and perfect introduction of the current status. We now have 1 or maximum 2 minutes for any pressing question. Does anyone has a question? There was no question raised in the chat box. I can't see anybody typing a question, so then I propose to go further with the presentation. And I'll give the floor to my colleague, Inge Mayeres. I would like to introduce her, of course. She holds a PhD in economics from KU Leuven and has been working about economics of transport and environmental issues since almost 30 years now in various projects at KU Leuven University, at the Federal Planning Office for the Belgian government, at Vito, and now since a few years at Transport and Mobility Leuven. I'll change the remote control to you, Inge, and then you will have the opportunity to change the slides. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wouter, and thank you also, Professor Delbeke, for the very good overview of the context that we are working in for the aviation sector. Today I will give a brief introduction to a study that we did for the European Commission and which was finalized at the end of the previous year, and which was about the role that can be played by sustainable aviation fuels to reduce the climate impact of European aviation. Let me see whether the remote control works. Yes, okay. So what I will present today is the results of that study, in which we evaluated from an economic point of view different policy options which are available to promote the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. For that analysis, we tried to make it as quantitative as possible, and in fact for the project we developed an economic model for the world transport fuel markets, which includes both aviation but also the other sectors, because there is some interaction between the different sectors if we want to study the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels. Now, the study that we carried out was for the Esfera project for DG Energy. TML was not the only partner involved in that study. In fact, we could build upon substantial expertise from other project partners, from Senasa and Onera and Wageningen University, who gave us the necessary background for all the different types of sustainable aviation fuels that exist and which feedstocks they are using in their production, also about the greenhouse gas emissions of these combinations, and also for the supply functions for different types of feedstock, because of course if you have a change in demand of sustainable aviation fuels together with fuels for the other transport sector, you can expect an impact on the prices of the feedstocks. And for this we could build upon analysis with the magnet model, which is a general equilibrium model for the world economy with a specific focus on the agricultural market and also for other markets which are important for this type of fuels. And that analysis was done by Wageningen University. A very brief overview of the model is given in this transparency. What you have to remember from this slide is that we consider aviation together with maritime transport and road transport. For aviation, we made a distinction between different markets. So the intra-EU aviation, but also aviation to and from the EU, and also aviation in the rest of the world. And we considered that these transport markets, that they can use both fossil fuels and different types of sustainable fuels using different feedstocks. So that's the main message from this slide. What are sustainable aviation fuels, first of all? These are hydrocarbon-based fuels derived from non-petroleum sources. They are called drop-in fuels because they can be used without any changes in the aircraft, but for the fuels that we considered, well, they can be used in aircraft, but very often there is a maximum share that can be used. So they cannot be used yet for 100% in a fuel tank. You have various production pathways with various feedstocks. The costs differ according to the fuel that you look at, and the impacts on emissions will also differ according to the type of fuel that you consider. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about the costs and the life cycle emissions of these fuels. Now, here you get an overview of the types of fuels that we considered in the analysis. In fact, these are the fuels that are also mentioned in the categories of the Renewable Energy Directive. So these are either advanced, so-called advanced biofuels, or fuels that are based on used cooking oils and animal fats. This is only a selection of the different fuels that are possible. But so based on the analysis which was done by the other partners in our research project, it was judged that these were the most likely to be able to play a role up to the period of 2030, which is the time horizon of our analysis. What you also see in the table, in the two last columns, are on the one hand, the well-to-wheel emissions of these different fuels, and on the other hand, the well-to-wheel emissions taking into account also the impacts from indirect land use change. And here you see that these different fuels, they have different impacts on the emissions of CO2. In some cases, for the fuels, the information was not always available for these emissions, and in those cases we used a very conservative assumption, namely that their emissions are similar to the ones of fossil jet fuel, and for that fuel you find the emissions at the bottom of the table. But for many fuels you see that even when you take into account indirect land use changes, there can be a reduction compared to the emissions of the fossil jet fuels. There is, I cannot switch to the next slide, it seems. Yeah, no, I think Sorry about that. In this figure, I included this figure simply to indicate to you that we are talking about fuel. So on the one hand, in blue, you see all the types of fuels that I mentioned in the previous table. And in green and a little bit of red, you see the prices of the fossil fuels. So here you see that compared to the prices of the fossil fuel, these sustainable aviation fuels are still quite expensive. Here you see only one value for each of these fuels. Of course, there is a range of estimates, but based on the analysis in the Sfera project, we took this as the central values. I should mention that so for the fossil jet fuel, we took into account the evolution as it was in the EU reference scenario of 2016. This reference scenario will have changed in the meantime, but you see in terms of order of magnitude what are the differences in costs. We also took into account the EU ETS system, which increases the costs for the fossil jet fuel. This is the thing which is given in dark red for the prices of the fossil fuels. So what did we do in the project? The project focused on sustainable aviation fuels. Of course, the aviation sector has many options to reduce the emissions, but so this project was about the sustainable aviation fuels. We looked at a number of scenarios. So first of all, we looked at the Renewable Energy Directive, the recast, so which was made in 2018. Which imposes a renewable energy share of 14% in 2030 for transport. So in fact, it uses a tradable blending mandate for transport. The target applies to road and rail transport, but air and maritime transport may contribute to the target. So there is no specific target for aviation in the Renewable Energy Directive, but the actions of aviation can be taken into account when judging whether this target of 14% is achieved. Aviation gets an extra incentive compared to road transport because when renewable fuels are used in the aviation sector, they get a multiplier of 1.2. So they get an extra incentive. So what we did is we looked at the impact of that RED II recasts, so the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive, and we also looked at a case where a higher multiplier applies for aviation, namely a multiplier of 2 rather than 1.2. And then, so as in the Renewable Energy Directive, there is no specific mandate for aviation. We also considered another scenario in which there is a specific blending mandate for aviation, and there were a lot of discussions in the project on what this blending mandate should be, how high. And we ended up in the discussions with 2 levels of 3.5% and 5.3% in 2030. You see, these are still very modest shares, but so we computed what would be the impact of these shares. And finally, we considered other policy instruments like a subsidy for sustainable aviation fuels. And this subsidy is determined such that we get a share also of about 3.5% in 2030. We also considered, but I don't show you the results here today, we also considered a fuel tax for aviation. So this was a bit a sensitive issue in the project. So I will not show results for that right now. Then we also looked at the CORSIA. Of course, there are many uncertainties still about this system. There is also uncertainty about what would be the offset prices. There is uncertainty about whether it would be combined with the ETS and to what extent, etc. So we assumed an offset price in 2030 of 50 euro per ton. We did another exercise with 10 euro per ton of CO2. This is an assumption that we made. And now I will show you some of the results of our analysis. If I can switch to the slides. Yes. So first of all, if we look at the RED II scenario variance, so either the RED II the recast of the Renewable Energy Directive, or the same directive but with a higher multiplier of for aviation fuels, then we see that there will be only a small take-up of sustainable aviation fuels. In the central case, so the RED directive as it is, we see that there is only about 1% of EU aviation fuel demand which will be sustainable aviation fuels in 2030. We also see that there is almost no impact on the user price of fuel for aviation. And in this central case, we also took into account the facts, important to mention, that the food and feed-based fuels are phased out by 2030. We also considered, in fact, the case if there is no such restriction on the food and feed-based fuels by 2030. And in that case, or when the restriction is less strict than what is in the Renewable Energy Directive, and then it turns out that in fact there will be even a smaller take-up of sustainable aviation fuels, because then it's cheaper to attain the share of the Renewable Energy Directive in the other transport sectors. And then we considered a higher multiplier for aviation, and then you see that there will be a larger uptake of the sustainable aviation fuels in 2030. So for the aviation sector, but in fact, if you look at the total amount of renewable energy used in the transport sector and the emissions, in fact, in the whole of the transport sector, this would be lower. So that's an unfortunate consequence of this higher multiplier. What we also did is we computed what is the cost of reducing CO2 emissions in the transport sector by means of this Renewable Energy Directive and the variant with the higher multiplier for aviation fuels. Then we arrive at costs that you see here per ton of CO2. So this is the welfare cost of reducing CO2, a ton of CO2 by means of this type of measures. That it's above 140 euro per ton. You can compare this, for instance, with the ETS prices, or with the cost of CO2 emissions, which is used in the manual for external transport costs of DG Move, which is about 100 euro per ton. And so you see that these costs of reduction by means of renewable fuels are quite high compared to the either the cost for the other sectors or the benefits of the CO2 reduction as the central estimate of the manual of DG Move presents. Then, we considered so the blending mandate specifically for aviation. So in this table you see, first of all, for the RED II, the impact on the sustainable aviation fuels. So that was 1%, as I mentioned before. The aviation fuel demand, the change in the fuel prices of aviation, and the change in the fuel price for road because of the RED II compared to the reference scenario. and then the impact on the CO2 emissions and the renewable energy use. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see what is taking place in the business as usual scenario in 2030. Maybe interesting to mention, in referring to the discussion by Jos Delbeke, is that if you look at the cost of fuel per ton of oil equivalent in the aviation sector, that this is quite lower than that of road transport, and that is because largely because of the difference in taxation. You also see that there is some difference between intra-EU and extra-EU aviation, and that's because of the ETS system.
Inge, you have 2 minutes more. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. With the blending mandate, what we see with the blending mandate is that, in fact, if you impose a blending mandate of 3.5 or 5.3%, that you indeed have, of course, an uptake of these fuels, that there will be an increase in the price, that for a small blending mandate, this price increase will be quite modest, but when the target increases more, then the price increases for fuel will be larger, it will increase more than proportionally. But with this blending mandate, you will have an impact, a larger impact on emissions than in the case of the RED II. If you have a subsidy, so a subsidy for sustainable aviation fuels, you could also attain this target of 3.5%. Then you would need a subsidy of about of more than 1,100 euro per ton of oil equivalent for these sustainable aviation fuels. The impact on the prices of fuel in aviation sector is in this case limited, which makes that you cannot benefit from the fact that this policy not only encourages the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels, as in the case of the blending mandate, but the blending mandate has also the additional impact that it reduces total fuel demand in the aviation sector, whereas in this case, with the subsidy, that will not happen. Here in this graph, you see then the associated social welfare costs of reducing the CO2 emissions in the aviation sector by means of this blending mandate and the subsidy. Among these three measures, the blending mandate is in fact the cheapest, but the cost remains very high. The cost with the subsidy is higher than the cost of a blending mandate. And that's because the blending mandate also reduces demand. Yeah. Okay. I will skip to the last slide, or the one before last slide. The conclusion is that reducing CO2 emissions in the aviation sector by imposing the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels is costly. But if one wants to promote the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels, then the recommendation would be to set a specific target for aviation if a tax cannot be imposed on fossil fuel. And then the target can be achieved at the lowest social cost by using a blending mandate. We also considered the CORSIA scenario, and in this case, you will have lower social abatement costs than with the other policies that I mentioned before, under the assumption that this CORSIA functions well and that the offsets are good offsets of good quality. But in this case, with the levels of the offsets price that we considered, there would be no uptake of SAFs. So the aviation sector would accommodate to these policy measures in different ways, but not by taking up SAFs. Okay. In the last slide, which will be distributed, I also included the contact details of all teams participating in the study, and also a link to the website where you can find the reports. And I apologize for speaking a bit much. Sorry.
No problem at all, Inge. Thank you very much for your presentation. In the chat box, there are 3 questions, so please, Inge, have a look, short look in the chat box. The first question is from Wouter Florizoone. Considering the fact that biofuels are unsustainable, and he would like to know, or she would like to know, the answer, right or wrong. So I think you can answer briefly. And then we have 2 more questions. One from Mr. Maedows concerning the sensitive issue about fossil fuel taxation, and then another question by Ben. So please, Inge, if you can answer these questions as briefly as possible. Thank you.
Yeah. So the biofuels, indeed, there is a lot of discussion about the biofuels. Here we considered the fuels that meet certain targets, environmental targets, so that do lead to a reduction of the CO2 emissions, even when taking into account indirect land use change. Of course, there are still many uncertainties, and this is really something which has to be controlled very well, and the certification system has to be very good for that. We can come back to that later. The fossil fuel taxation was a sensitive issue. We did do some calculations, and it would be an interesting issue. But so in the project, it was a project with stakeholders in which there was also stakeholders from the aviation sector and also the fuel sectors were involved. And it was we should always. They pointed out that we should always take into account the international context in which fuel taxation is still difficult. But I feel that things are moving in this direction, more in this direction, so that's a very good evolution, because in fact it would be a very interesting policy instrument. Then how do you assess the perspective of SAFs in comparison with hydrogen of battery-powered aircraft? So our analysis was the analysis up to 2030, and with that time horizon, I think the evolutions in about these different propulsion types are still, they are further away, so that's more for the longer term. Also, in the case of the fuels that we considered, so synthetic fuels could also be an option, but depending on whether they meet the environmental objectives. But this also, during that study, was not considered because of the time horizon.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a last question by Jos.
Kerosene tax with an exemption for SAFs. Yes, the kerosene tax is a very interesting solution, and so in the report there is also some information on fuel taxation.
Okay.
We can come back to that.
Perfect. We can come back to this later in the discussion round with the 3 speakers. Thank you very much again, Inge, for your presentation and your answers towards the questions. Now I would like to go to our last speaker, which is Mr. Damien Maedows. Here he is. Mr. Maedows, he's the advisor on the European and international carbon markets at the European Commission within DG Climate Action. He has been involved in developing market-based responses to climate change since the year of 2000, including as head of the European Commission's unit for the international carbon market, aviation and maritime, and as a deputy head as well for the unit responsible for EU ETS from 2006 until 2010. He was working on drafting, negotiation and implementation of the EU ETS, ratification of the Kyoto Protocol and other climate related legislation. And before joining the Commission, he was a solicitor in the UK, working for the UK government in private practice as well as for the UNFCCC Secretariat. Mr. Maedows, I will give you the control by now, and the digital floor is yours.
Thanks, Wouter, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll try and be relatively quick. I've just got 5 slides to top off what Jos and Inge have already said. The first slide is, just jump forward. Wouter, I might need your help if it's not.
Yeah, I'll give it.
Perfect. So, I mean, Jos has outlined where we are now, and I mean, the ETS is working. This system covers half our economy. It applies to aviation, but that's a tiny part of it. I mean, this is discussed at European Council. It's led to emission reductions of around 1/3 from half of the European economy up to 2018. And it's raised something like 60 billion euros in auction revenue. So this is a big ETS of which aviation is a tiny part. And in a world where global governance is suboptimal, I think Europe's made an important contribution here, working also with China over the last decade. They're developing a similar system, and they've made very positive announcements this week. Now, when it comes to aviation, I mean, this price incentive is already offering $100 per ton for the use of biofuels because the ETS zero rates them. It would be nice to see biofuels being taken up with this kind of price incentive. Doesn't seem to be the case yet. We know that ETS delivers low-cost emission reductions. That's why the Parliament and Council have topped up the system. We have a 12 billion euro fund for innovation, and this covers refineries, chemical plants, it covers batteries, it covers synthetic fuel, hydrogen, ammonia. So I would very much hope that airline stakeholders actually apply for support from this fund. It would, I think, show that they're serious at bridging the distance that's needed to commercial competitiveness for cleaner fuels, cleaner operations. ETS is only part of the picture, of course. I mean, we have a single sky proposal made even this week by the Commission to bring 10% emission reductions if the member states adopt it. So we know we need action economy-wide. On my next slide, I'll talk specifically about what's proposed on the ETS. But there's 4 other important elements on this slide. Sorry, I have to jump back, Wouter. Obviously, with the coronavirus situation, we have a huge challenge on our hands. With a 750 billion euro spending to recover European economies, this should be green spending. The use of state aid should be for the economy that we need in the future. So far, there has been a lot of subsidies to airlines, to Lufthansa, to Air France, and so on. This is liquidity aid, it's preventing bankruptcies. But I would hope as we go forward that aid will focus on coming out of the corona situation with the cleaner economy, the greener economy that we need. The second element here is the Commission, DG Move leading, should propose an initiative for sustainable fuels by the end of 2020, Refuel EU. You can find information about this online. I can't really say much more. My colleagues in DG Taxud are working on the energy taxation directive revision. There's a public consultation open right now. I would agree with Inge and Jos that if there were taxation here, and it is a total myth that the Chicago Convention prevents this, what you have is airlines who don't want this. I understand their commercial position, but in terms of broader society, we don't all have to agree with that situation. So there's the revision of the energy tax directive and also the operational improvements, the single sky proposal adopted this week. Now, in the State of the Union address by President von der Leyen, she was very clear on the importance of addressing the climate crisis, among other issues. she said, and many member states and the Parliament have endorsed this, that we should achieve at least a 55% economy-wide emission reduction by 2030 and move to climate neutrality by 2050. If we don't do so, the consequences of climate change on our societies is going to be pretty devastating. I mean, it's cost effective to prevent a climate crisis. And it's important that she focused on this economy-wide reduction. She said that all sectors should contribute to emission reductions, and this includes aviation and shipping. I remember, actually, I mean, I started working on this in the 90s, but it was 1994 when, for the time being, aviation was left out of targets in recognition that states would be taking responsibility. Now, a quarter of a century later, the Commission has said that Europe should take responsibility at least for intra-European aviation emissions and intra-European shipping emissions. This is important because under the EU ETS so far, the European Airlines Association has said that it's led to 193 million tons of emissions reductions. This is significant. An intra-European ETS is much smaller in terms of impacts than covering all flights. But legally, I mean, it's proven the ability to regulate all airlines with a level playing field. And as Jos said, you absolutely need that level playing field. So one important thing said last week is the regulation of intra-European aviation emissions. The next element is the increased auctioning for aviation. Railways are mostly electric and have been covered by the emissions trading system for 15 years. They've rarely complained, they get no free allocation, and they're supportive of policy that addresses the climate crisis through European and global action, but without saying, let's wait until we have something global and no one do anything. So what's said now is that aviation should move to a situation more similar to railways, because currently they're receiving 800 million euros for free in terms of allocation under the ETS. Now, Inge, I'd be interested in your views. I mean, if you used 800 million euros for contracts for difference to bridge the price gap from ETS to the costs of sustainable aviation fuel, presumably this could kickstart the actual deployment of these fuels. So I think ideas are very welcome on how to use this money if and when we move towards more auctioning. The final point on this slide is that the Commission will use the ETS. The EU has agreed that we will use the ETS to implement ICAO's CORSIA offsetting scheme. Europe is the most multilateral part of the world. We love the UN, we want their systems to work, and we want CORSIA to work. My worry would be that Inge's figure for the cost of credits is about 200 times the price of eligible credits to be used in the EU ETS right now, eligible international credits. So if the actual price is €1/5 of a euro of the cost of issuing these credits, as it is today, then that doesn't seem to provide much incentive for in-sector reductions. The other issue is, I think, we need more transparency. Europe has publicly said it will implement CORSIA. I would love to see such a commitment from the United States, who previously have said that their actions are dependent on China. China has described CORSIA as immoral and unfair. So I would agree with Jos, it would be tremendous for ICAO if China would sign up. But I'm hoping to see that. I haven't seen it yet. If I come to my third slide, so yeah, in terms of biofuel, I mean, this week we've had from Airbus announcements on hydrogen. We've had them in the past on electrification. It's great to have these announcements if they follow through. Otherwise, there's a risk that these announcements are too easily swallowed by journalists and used as a reason for deferring real action in the here and now. So the history of biofuel targets has been less than impressive. IATA, the industry association, said they wanted 10% biofuels used by 2017, 3 years ago now. the situation is we have 1/20% of jet fuel is biofuels. So this is very small. I would hope that, I mean, the ETS already encourages this, but I think the real issue would be taxation, that its air service agreements have been the obstacle. And if we're able to move forward in air service agreements, removing the exemption provisions, particularly, say, with the future US administration, which seriously wanted to tackle climate change, I mean, we could make dramatic change. And I come now to my last slide. Last two slides, actually. So fundamentally, in my 20 years in the Commission, I've learned from some very good mentors about the importance of economics. If you don't get the economics right, you're not going to solve the problem when fossil fuels are cheaper than the alternatives. The first quote on this slide comes from Barack Obama. It's a very good one. He was a very eloquent president about the need to tilt the level playing field towards cleaner products, towards more efficient engines, more efficient operations. The other quote is much shorter and blunter. It comes from President von der Leyen. Carbon emissions must have a price and all sectors must contribute. Otherwise, I fear this cartoon will be true, that basically we could spend forever talking about what needs to be done without actually doing it. And that, in my view and the view of the Commission, would be pretty catastrophic. We're in a bad situation today. I would love to be in an auditorium with you all today. That's not possible. But as President von der Leyen said, we will sooner or later have a cure for the coronavirus. There is not a vaccine for climate change. We need to reduce our emissions, and that means aviation also contributing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Damien. Thank you very much for your presentation, and ending also with some quotes and cartoons. I would like to invite all speakers to switch on their camera and their microphone, and then I'll have a look to the last questions. There was a question from Mr. Hemmings concerning fuel taxation for aviation, and I don't know, Mr. Maedows, Damien, would you like to answer this question? And there was also another answer on the question concerning the Chicago Convention. I would like to invite you to have a quick look to this question, and if you feel available to answer this question, please give an answer.
I muted myself. Very happy to, Wouter. I mean, it's fascinating for academics to look at this, because the number of myths about aviation is quite incredible. And it is quite simply not true that the Chicago Convention prevents taxation of fuel. If you uplift fuel at Zaventem Airport, you can be taxed on that fuel, and the Chicago Convention does not prevent it. There was an international treaty that never entered into force, the London Convention, which said that nobody should tax aviation fuel ever. Thank goodness that didn't enter into force. So the only obstacle is that Europe has agreed with America, with Canada, well, particularly with America, that it will not tax aviation fuel when airlines upload that fuel in Europe. And Europe, in 2005, there was a Commission communication saying we should remove these fuel tax exemptions. But I think, is it, somebody can tell me who said the quote, that it's terribly hard to convince somebody of something when their job depends on it. I mean, our aviation negotiators backed down to Vietnam, they backed down to Korea, they backed down to South Africa. Only, to my knowledge, with Morocco have we succeeded in saying that when aviation fuel is supplied, we should be free as Europeans to tax that aviation fuel if we choose to do so. And now we're seeing with the United Kingdom whether when they take back control, they would also like to take back control in this area. So it could be an interesting year, 2020, particularly with the new US administration, but it is solely the air service agreements that are the obstacle, and European legislation that's on the way to being revised, the Energy Tax Directive.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer. Are there any other questions?
Perhaps Wouter, Jos Delbeke here. If I can just reinforce what Damien said, we are, of course, sooner or later in the post-COVID crisis, going to look for new tax revenue. We all hope that's not going to be soon, but it's going to come that moment. And then when you ask yourself, there are many ideas out there, but I think certainly a tax on kerosene, the way Damien described it, should be part of the Energy Tax Directive, I think, knowing that the international aviation is not going to be checked on its greenhouse gas emissions through CORSIA. I mean, that's a bit of a disappointment to me personally. I was involved in that process for so many years, and I think we missed the opportunity through the EU ETS. Now, carbon pricing remains important, and if we are not going to do it either through the EU ETS or through CORSIA, then I think we have to revert to where the whole story started, and that is kerosene taxation. And I think there would be a lot of support in the population widely, not only in Belgium, but across Europe, because it's hard to explain that a ticket from, say, Brussels to the south of Spain doesn't cost more than 5 or 10 euros, while you pay a multiple when you go by car or by train. So I think if there is a candidate,